Post-embryonic development begins after the emergence of the embryo from the egg and embryonic membranes, when the organism becomes capable of active feeding and locomotion. Upon transition to the post-embryonic state, the organism either immediately possesses the principal pubertal morphological characteristics, that is, direct development, or essentially differs from the pubertal form, in which the larva that hatches out of the egg must undergo a metamorphosis before it reaches its adult state. Growth continues during the period of post-embryonic development, and further organogenesis and histogenesis occur. The functions of the developing organism become more complex. Establishment of the final proportions of the body is distinct. From the development of the eggs in the female and the sperm in the male and their union, there is a series of changes, often involving several unlike forms, which lead to adulthood and the production of progeny for the next generation. This sequential growth from the fertilized egg to a sexually mature adult constitutes the life cycle of the individual. There is great variability among insects in the length of the life cycle, from a few days to many years, in the method of development, in the appearance and habits of the stages leading to adulthood, and even between successive life cycles. Post-embryonic development in insects. The process of post-embryonic development of egg can be studied under the following headings. 1. Hatching. The process of hatching or eclosion from the egg varies greatly in different groups. After eclosion, the young insect usually commences feeding and growing without delay. Almost most insects lay eggs. A few deposit living young instead of eggs. 2. Molting. As the insect integument is not cellular, it cannot grow by the addition of cells. It also has very little stretch and so cannot be extended to accommodate growth. Because of this, the insect must periodically shed its old skin and replace it with a larger one. This process is called a molt and is controlled by a molting hormone. Picture showing an adult cicada following molting from the pupa. Note the cast skin of the pupa or excuvia. Let us now watch a video on molting in insects. Three instars. The intervals between the molts are known as stages or stadia, and the form assumed by an insect during a particular stadium is termed an instar. When an insect emerges from the egg, it is said to be in its first instar. Then, at the end of this stadium, the first molt occurs and the insect then assumes its second instar and so on. Most insects molt at least 3 or 4 times, but in some cases 30 or more molts may occur. The average is 5 or 6 molts. The molts represent significant biological landmarks in the events which occur during the life of an insect. The final instar is a mature form which is known as the adult stage. Entry into this stage is controlled by the absence of a hormone, the so-called juvenile hormone, the presence of which keeps the insect from reaching maturity. 4. Metamorphosis. One of the most characteristic features of insects is the fact that they almost always hatch in a morphologically different form from the adult. In order to achieve the adult stage, they have to pass through changes of form which are collectively termed metamorphosis. There are 2 main types of metamorphosis in insects. A. Simple metamorphosis. Other terms describing this type of metamorphosis are direct, incomplete, or gradual. The immature stages or nymphs resemble the adult, except that the wings develop gradually as external pads, the genitalia are incomplete, and there are often color differences as well as the obvious size differences. The principal changes during growth are in size, body proportions, the development of the ocelli, the size of the wings, and occasionally in the form of the antenna, mouth parts, abdomen, and other structures. B. Complex metamorphosis. This term is applied to those insects which pass through a complex series of changes, the first after the egg stage being the larva. The larva passes through several instars which are more or less grub-like and are usually similar in form but differ in size. Larvae do not have wings or compound eyes. They may or may not have thoracic legs, and they sometimes possess leg-like appendages called prolegs on the abdomen. Photo showing a young larva of the pine butterfly. Photo showing a mature larva of the pine butterfly. C. Pupa. Following the molt of the last larval instar, the insect transforms into a stage called the pupa. This stage is the resting inactive instar in most insects undergoing metamorphosis. The insect is incapable of feeding during this stage and is quiescent. It is the transitional phase during which the larval body and its organs are remolded to fit the requirements of the adult. Although normally motionless, many pupae are capable of limited locomotion, particularly towards the end of the stadium. D. Cocoon. During the pupal instar, insects are particularly vulnerable as they are limited in movement and lacking defenses. These liabilities are overcome in many ways, such as concealment, protective coloration, or hard covering and enclosure within a cocoon. The cocoon is usually prepared by the last instar larva and may be constructed of wood chips, sand and gravel, body hairs or vegetable matter, but chiefly from the silk produced by the larva. Many insect larvae do not fabricate free existing cocoons, but construct cells in the ground or in their habitat, usually lined with silk, in which to pupate. Emergence from the cocoon or pupal chamber may be by the adult chewing or cutting its way out by the means of special organs, by rupturing of the cocoon with muscular contractions, or by softening the cocoon with a secretion whereby the adult may push its way out. Picture showing the last instar larva of the Douglas fir tussock moth spinning its cocoon. Photo showing the completed cocoons. Just prior to the emergence of the adult, the pupa usually darkens markedly in color. After emergence, there is usually a resting period while the still soft tissues harden. The time of emergence varies greatly, as does the time it takes before the adult is able to carry on its activities. Adult insects are seldom sexually mature immediately upon emergence. Most must mate before they can develop viable eggs, but some have the ability to produce young without fertilization, that is, parthenogenesis. When this happens, the young produced are all of the same sex. Photo showing mother aphids and parthenogenetically produced young one on a leaf. Adult insects have a normal lifespan ranging from a few days to several years depending on the species. Life cycles. The life cycle is the development of the individual from egg to egg. Many forest insects have one generation each year, in which case they are said to be univoltine. In these insects, the life cycle is synchronized to the seasonal cycle, often by the overwintering stage. The overwintering stage determines which stage of the insect begins the seasonal cycle, and this is usually determined by the requirements of the species. For example, insects whose young larvae require new foliage usually overwinter as eggs or very young larvae. Entry into the overwintering stage is usually stimulated by declining day length in the fall, and the process of overwintering is called diapause. Other forest insects have several or many generations in a single year, in which case they are called multivoltine. The impact of this concept is obvious for a destructive insect having 5 generations in a season pose entirely different problems from one which completes its development in one season. In a few insects, such as the 17-year cicada, the life cycle may encompass many seasons. Alternation of generations. In several groups of insects, succeeding generations are quite different in the method of reproduction, morphology, and sometimes in feeding habits. This is called alternation of generations. Most of these have reproduction only by adults, although one generation may have sexual adults while the next may be parthenogenetic. A few have reproduction by adults and by immature forms. The life cycles are usually complicated, involving alternate hosts, winged and non-winged adults, different feeding patterns, etc. The aphids or Homoptera and the gall wasps or Hymenoptera are the most typical of these groups. Post-embryonic changes in amphibians. The egg. The amphibians, like frog's egg, are a huge cell. Its volume is over 1.6 million times larger than a normal frog cell. During embryonic development, the egg will be converted into a tadpole containing millions of cells, but containing the same amount of organic matter. The upper hemisphere of the egg, the animal pole, is dark. The lower hemisphere, the vegetal pole, is light. When deposited in the water and ready for fertilization, the haploid egg is at the metaphase of meiosis II. Fertilization. Entrance of the sperm initiates a sequence of events. Meiosis II is completed. The cytoplasm of the egg rotates about 30 degrees relative to the poles. In some amphibians, including Xenopus, this is revealed by the appearance of a light-colored band, the gray crescent. The gray crescent forms opposite the point where the sperm entered. It foretells the future pattern of the animal. Its dorsal D and ventral V surfaces, its anterior A and posterior P, its left and right sides. The haploid sperm and egg nuclei fuse to form the diploid zygote nucleus. Metamorphosis in amphibians. In typical amphibian development, eggs are laid in water and larvae are adapted to an aquatic lifestyle. Frogs, toads, and newts all hatch from the egg as larvae with external gills. But it would take some while for the amphibians to interact outside with pulmonary respiration. Afterwards, newt larvae start a predatory lifestyle, while tadpoles mostly scrape food off surfaces with their horny tooth ridges. Metamorphosis in amphibians is regulated by thyrosin concentration in the blood, which stimulates metamorphosis, and prolactin, which counteracts its effect. Specific events are dependent on threshold values for different tissues. Because most embryonic development is outside the parental body, development is subject to many adaptations due to specific ecological circumstances. For this reason, tadpoles can have horny ridges for teeth, whiskers, and fins. They also make use of the lateral line organ. After metamorphosis, these organs become redundant and will be reabsorbed by the controlled cell death called apoptosis. Metamorphosis in frogs. The egg. Many species lay their eggs in calm water amongst vegetation where the eggs can develop in relative safety. The female frog lays numerous eggs in masses that tend to clump together. These egg masses are referred to as spawn. The egg begins as a single cell. It becomes surrounded by a jelly-like covering which protects the egg. As the female frog deposits the eggs, the male releases sperm onto the egg masses and fertilizes the eggs. In many species of frogs, the adults leave the eggs to develop without further care. But in a few species, parents remain with the eggs to look after them as they develop. As the fertilized eggs mature, the yolk in each egg splits into more and more cells and it begins to take on the form of a tadpole. Within 1 to 3 weeks, the egg is ready to hatch and a tiny tadpole breaks free of the egg. The embryo. The mass of cells in the egg come to form an embryo. The embryo soon starts to look more and more like a tadpole. getting longer and moving about in its egg. Organs and gills begin to form, and the embryo lives on the internal yolk. This supplies it with nutrients for 21 days. The egg will then hatch in 6 to 12 days after fertilization. The tadpole. After 21-day development period, the embryo leaves its jelly shell and attaches itself to a weed in the water. This quickly becomes a tadpole. During this period, the tadpole feeds on the remaining yolk in its gut. The tadpole at this point consists of poorly developed gills, a mouth, and a tail. The external gills help to absorb oxygen and it continues to feed on algae. It is extremely vulnerable and must rely on its camouflage to protect it. The colors range from brown, green, or grey. After 7 to 10 days from hatching, it begins to swim around and it feeds on algae. By the 4th week, tadpoles become fairly social creatures. After about 4 weeks, the gills start getting grown over by skin until they eventually disappear. The tadpoles get teeny tiny teeth which help them grate food, turning it into soupy oxygenated particles. They have long coiled guts that help them digest as much nutrients from their mere diets as possible. The tadpole begins to change. After 5 weeks, the tadpole begins to change. It starts to grow hind legs, which are soon followed with forelegs. Lungs begin to develop. It prepares the frog for its life on land. The head becomes more distinct and the body elongates. Its mouth widens. It loses its horny jaws and gills are completely lost. The diet now grows to include larger items like dead insects and even plants. Gradually, the tail becomes much smaller and the legs grow. After about 9 weeks, the lungs are almost functioning and the tadpole looks more like a teeny frog with a small tail. The froglet. Over time, the tadpole becomes even more frog-like. It is only a teeny tail stub and looks like a miniature version of the adult frog. Soon, it will leave the water only to return again to lay more eggs. The frog. Within 11 to 12 weeks after the egg was laid, a fully developed frog with lungs, legs, and no tail emerges from the water. This frog will live mostly on land with occasional swims. Eventually, it finds a mate. The way this is done varies depending on the species. The female lays the eggs, the male fertilizes them, and the whole process begins again. Let us now watch a video on the metamorphosis in amphibians. Conclusion. Dear students, in this lesson, we saw the post-embryonic development of insects and amphibians. To conclude, we can say that in some animals, post-embryonic development constitutes the greater part of their lifespan. Among insects, in a number of cicadas, the larva lives 17 years, while the pubertal insect lives one summer. The mayfly larva lives to 3 years, but often in its pubertal form, the mayfly lives only 1 day. The frog has been historically used as an amphibian animal model of development due to the ease of observation from the fertilized egg to the tadpole stage. The later metamorphosis of the tadpole to the frog has also been studied for hormonal controls and limb development. There have also been many different species used in these developmental studies. The necessity for defense against enemies and the active food procurement are ensured during post-embryonic development by a number of adaptations that make the animal self-sufficient, sometimes for its entire lifespan. With indirect or larval development, the animal having larval organs is self-sufficient only during the post-embryonic period.